Hello and welcome to The Bad Take, episode number 2. My name is Himal.
And my name is Tamara. Before we move on to the topic for today, I just want to take a couple of minutes to thank everyone who listened to our first episode. There was a lot of positive, constructive feedback coming in. We loved hearing your thoughts about the podcast. We just hope that you guys would keep listening in and keep giving us feedback. Going forward, we also want to hear about your suggestions for things that we can talk about. But for today, we have taken a topic that we both have very, strong opinions on. I will let Himal introduce the topic.
Today we are going to talk about atheism, which has been a pretty polarizing topic, not just internationally but locally as well. Tamara, do you want to define the word for us?
Yeah, since that has become my job here at the podcast, let me just consult our friend Google. Google says atheism is the disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods.
That is, I believe, the general definition of the word, but today the word atheist is used to describe basically anyone who doesn't subscribe to any religion. I don't think atheism is strictly about the lack of belief in a god or gods. Anyone who doesn't subscribe to any religion, organized or otherwise, is called an atheist these days.
Yes, that's been my reading of it as well. I see a lot of people who don't subscribe to any religion increasingly identifying and describing themselves as atheists. So Himal, I would just like to know where you stand on all this.
I don't like to really talk about my beliefs or lack thereof personally, but for the sake of this discussion, I will say that I am not a religious person. I haven't been for a long time now. I grew up a Buddhist. I was a Buddhist for much of my life, but then I almost stumbled upon atheism, and I have not looked back since. There was a time when I was a staunch atheist to the point that I would go out of my way to quote unquote convert religious people into my worldview. I don't do that anymore. I've moved on. I don't think that's a very productive way to live your life. What do you think? Where do you stand on this?
I think my personal journey related to religion has also been very similar. I mean, we could be talking about the same person here. Same school, same surroundings, same kind of friends. I was only exposed to other religious viewpoints and faiths when I started associating with friends who came from outside my school. And since then, I started reading up on those things. And there came a point where I questioned myself whether I should subscribe to just one religion. And then it evolved to a point where I convinced myself that not subscribing to any religion was the most open-minded self I could be, and that's where I still stand. And I also went through a phase where I wanted to attack people and mock them, mostly on social media when they express their religious viewpoints, but I don't do that now. But that said, I also have to admit that I have this urge to debate people. For example, when there's something like Buddhism is not a religion, it's a philosophy, it's a way of life. What I want to say to them is, what makes something a religion is the way it's practiced. The experiential and the ritualistic elements of Buddhism make it very much a religion and not just a philosophy that you can study. And I think all these people should get off their high horses and see things for what they are.
What you're saying is that a religion requires a belief in the supernatural? Is that how you understand it? In other words, does it require a degree of blind faith?
I believe so. If you were to talk to someone who is super religious and very devout in their faith, you will find out that they have some beliefs which defy logic and defy scientific understanding of the universe. And these are just realities that they have viewed for themselves. And I tend to get a little riled up when people start bashing atheism on social media, and I've seen this increasingly, especially in certain parts of Twitter. Atheism gets a very bad rap. Do you know why that is?
Well, that can be due to any number of reasons, but I think the biggest one I can think of is the fact that on the internet, given the nature of social media, you get a lot of argumentative children. I don't think these are adults. A lot of them are like maybe in their late teens or early 20s. Basically a bunch of edgelords who have kind of taken it upon themselves to bash religion wherever they can and make hurtful remarks and basically be dicks online. And it's safe to say a lot of them, a majority of them, are followers of prominent figures in the so-called New Atheist movement.
Since you mentioned the New Atheist movement, let me just flag this for anyone who's listening. You can look up this Wired article, which we will link to in the show notes, which coined this phrase, the New Atheist movement. And they included certain people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, who have always been very vocal about their views on religion. But I also want to say that it's not on themselves. I wouldn't blame them for the rise of this confrontational, argumentative movement against religion that you talked about earlier, because the way I see it, it's their followers who have taken this as a burden onto themselves to discredit religious people on their experiences.
I hear what you're saying, but I mean, how fair is that statement? I mean, these guys like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and even Sam Harris, like huge, larger than life personalities and the celebrities almost, and they have followings in the millions, I think. Can they really absolve themselves of any culpability in this? Should not they be held accountable?
You have a point, but I also think we should cut them some slack. I mean, they're only human. There's only so much they can do to keep all their followers in check. And what happens most of the time is when you are a celebrity and a person with reasonable fame, people always tend to take the things you say out of context and give it their own interpretations and use it to their own advantage. In this case, maybe against a religious person or a spiritual person, which I think accounts for most of the hostility.
I don't know about that, because there are allegations that a number of these guys have a tendency to use their rationality, their crusade for rationality, to cloak their racism and any other bigoted views that they might have. Didn't Richard Dawkins recently tweet something completely horrific about Islam?
Yeah, it's good that you brought it up. I think what happened was he was on a morning stroll or whatever near his local church, and he just tweeted out saying the church bells are a lot more pleasant to hear than the calls to prayer that you hear at a mosque, which I thought was a bit too extreme.
You say extreme, I say racist. But enough about the new atheists. Let's talk about Sri Lanka. Lately, there's been quite a bit of conversation in Sri Lanka, at least in the Sinhala medium, centered around the topic of religion and atheism as well as secularism. In the West, what I've noticed is that the progressive movement is not overly fond of the more vocal proponents of atheism, at least in the US, because, like I said earlier, they're kind of seen as using their rationalist discourse to mask their racism. Whereas here, at least the way I see it, it's usually the progressive ones who are trying to get a discussion going on this topic. That to me is quite interesting. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've noticed this too, and especially if you take the Sinhala Twitter sphere, you see the word Niragamika being thrown around a lot, mostly as an insult. So with all this going on, are you hesitant to identify yourself as an atheist or a non-believer?
To be honest, yes. Like I said earlier, I have always believed that religion should be a strictly personal affair. But aside from that, because atheism as a concept has so much negativity surrounding it, I do think twice before I open up about something like that, unless you're really close to me as a friend. Otherwise, no, it's a topic I generally tend to avoid. What about you?
Yeah, I am the same way actually. I don't really like bringing in religion to any of my discussions. One reason is the fact that I'm almost always surrounded by very religious people, whether it's in a family setting or among my friends. I choose not to talk about that topic and keep my beliefs to myself.
Interesting. I have a question. Now, when you find yourself in a religious setting, like with family, for example, like at an almsgiving or something, there's a monk preaching, giving a sermon or whatever, and everyone else around you is like they have their hands together and they're saying the equivalent of prayers, like Kathakina. What would you do in a situation like that? Like I personally don't know what to do. That's something I struggle with. My immediate family knows that I'm not religious at all, but my extended family doesn't. I kind of sit and do what everyone else does just for the sake of appearance. How has that experience been for you?
Very similar, but in some occasions I do have a scapegoat. I have this set of cousins who share the same opinions as me about religion. So we just basically get together and remove ourselves from the situation and hang out somewhere else.
Good for you. That's not a luxury I can afford, because my extended family is very religious. I don't want to like put on a show and just pretend that I'm something that I'm not. But how easy is it for somebody to come out as an atheist? I don't know that I could do it. I need to say this, however. Yes, atheism gets a bad rap, but I see more and more conversation about it taking place online. I think that's a good thing. I don't know if we as a society are ready to have that conversation yet, but I think we're getting there, and that's quite encouraging. I mean, ultimately, it really boils down to what everybody's personal truth is, right?
Yes, I agree with you, and I am really glad that you brought up personal truth, because that reminds me of something that I heard just the other week. We are both, I guess we could say, fans of Neil deGrasse Tyson.
No, I'm not.
I'm just gonna go ahead and say that I am a fan of Neil deGrasse Tyson, and this is something that he said. He says there are 3 kinds of truths. The first one is an objective truth, which is the kind of truth that science searches for. When you apply the scientific method to something, an objective truth is what you end up with. So an objective truth is something that is true whether you believe in it or not. Then there are personal truths. A personal truth is something that you believe, but it does not mean that someone else has to believe. It's something that you convince yourself about. We can argue the whole day about the use of the word truth here because it's being used quite ambiguously, but just for the sake of argument, let me use the word truth liberally. The third kind of truth is a political truth. That is something that becomes true when you just keep on repeating it. Like, for example, when Donald Trump keeps saying that New York Times is fake news, people kind of believe it eventually. So what I want to say is religion is a personal truth. It's something that you believe. It's okay for you to believe whatever the fuck you want, as long as you don't try to show that down someone else's throat. And that's how I think about religion. I am quite comfortable being an atheist, being a non-believer, and I'm quite sure that religious people have their own reasons for believing in what they believe. As long as people understand their boundaries and not try to invade each other's personal convictions, I guess we are fine.
It's interesting you should mention this whole thing about religious being shoved down people's throats. I mean, if you think about it, atheists can be, at least the militant atheists can be accused of doing the same thing, right? Religion is not all bad. There's a lot of good that can be said about religion.
I agree. The first thing that comes to my mind is all the amazing architecture and works of art and literature that religion has inspired. You can't deny the role of religion in bringing these things to light. There is also the fact that religion offers a level of comfort and belonging that atheism cannot offer. For example, if you are a very religious person, I can imagine how comforting it must be to think that your dead mother is now in heaven and enjoying a very comfortable life. But at the same time, I also think it's not very productive to be a religious and a good person just because you have this reward waiting for you at your death or in your next life. I think Alan Watts said this best. He said, the problem with religion is that people practice it as a form of self-punishment, as a grim duty, and they do all this for a shot at this perfect state of existence, which in turn denies you the opportunity of living in the present moment and enjoying your present life. So when you consider all that, do you think that religion is still relevant?
Yeah, I would say it is. I mean, I have always been a strong advocate for secularism, but I think religion is important and very much relevant in that it keeps so many people in check. Religion, for literally billions of people, acts as almost a magnetic north to their moral compass. Yes, there is the law. You could argue that human beings are hardwired to be inherently good and decent, but I think some of us need religion to act as a guiding light, if you will. And if you were to suddenly surgically remove religion from society, I don't think that would necessarily turn out to be a good thing. At least in the short term, we'll be looking at a rather chaotic moral landscape.
Since you talked about religion keeping people in check and acting as a deterrent and also acting as a moral guidance to people, I'm not so sure how relevant and effective 2000-year-old books are to today's world. I mean, we all know how slow religion has been in catching up with things like the acceptance of homosexuality, for example, not to mention all the advancements of science. So, while I agree that religion can be pretty important to some people in that it gives them a sense of belonging and a sense of community, I'm not a fan of the concept that we should base our morals on religion itself. Let me also put this thought out there. I think the real need people have is one of spirituality and not religion. Like you said, if we surgically removed religion from society overnight, people will always come up with something else to believe in. What they need is something to bring them together, preferably something that they think is bigger than themselves. The way I see things, we can also develop this sense of belonging by just looking out into the universe. If you've read Carl Sagan's work, he explained this very beautifully in what is now very popularly known as the pale blue dot. He talks about our place in the universe and how insignificant we seem. And I understand that some people might find that thought demeaning, but I find that very liberating. And that's because thanks to science, we know that we are made of the same stuff that stars are made of. There's no greater sense of belonging than that to me, and I find it very spiritual.
Oh, too deep for me. No, I think that's a salient point to end this discussion on. Bigger and better thinkers than us have put forward this same point far more eloquently than we could ever hope to. Like Tamara mentioned, you could look up Carl Sagan's famous quote, "The pale blue dot." It's an achingly beautiful, poignant look at our place in the universe. The sheer insignificance of it is enough to drive you into an existential crisis almost. But there is also, I think, a personal truth, isn't it? What you or I may believe as insignificance, I mean, ultimately we are nothing, we are cosmic dust, right? But that may not be the case for someone else. I mean, it's their truth. I don't know who we are to make that call. And on that note, what do you guys think? Do you think in this day and age, in 2018, do you think religion is still relevant?
Yeah, we've tried to answer that question as well as we could have within this short time. But like Himal said, we'd love to know what you guys think. As always, you guys can get in touch with us. I'm on Twitter as Master Tamara. Himal is on Twitter at HimalKK. We also have a new blog that we put up just to include all the show notes to everything that we discuss about in these episodes. You can already find the show notes for this episode and the previous episode on this blog. Just go to medium.com at the bad take, and it'll all be there.
And for those of you who prefer to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we just started a channel.
You can also find this podcast on different platforms now, thanks to Anchor. We are on Apple Podcasts, Castbox, Google Podcasts, Overcast, Spotify, Stitcher, and we are pretty sure that if you search for The Bad Take on your favorite podcast app, there's a pretty good chance that we'll pop right up.
Alright, thank you guys.